Welcome again. I tried making some videos about gender studies terms, and the my laptop overheated sitting in the sun upstairs. So I came downstairs to the cool basement. A reminder that I am not a gender studies scholar, so my the depth of my pedagogy in teaching this terminology is not that expanded. Also, I think it's important to say that some of these terms can be somewhat challenging and new for a lot of people. And so I try to include different ways of helping you visualize that or understand some of these concepts, particularly those of you who are gender studies majors or minors and want to chime in to the discussion boards. I think that's really helpful. But as you try to explore and think about these concepts and maybe even use them as you begin to analyze and talk about some of the works of art that we're going to be experiencing, please don't be afraid of using them, quote, incorrectly. I'm not the gender studies police. I'm not the political correctness police. I believe in those things, but I also believe that it can be complicated and challenging to think about some of these ideas, especially for the first time. And so I'm not going to be mad if you, quote, use them incorrectly, as long as you're being respectful and I think considerate in your expressing of your ideas or opinions. You may disagree with each other, you may disagree with me, and those are all perfectly fine things. So I just want to say that at the onset, that some of these ideas are new and can be challenging. One of the biggest ideas, at least for me in the very beginning, the first time I was exposed to these concepts, is that there's a difference between sex and gender. That sex is this genetic and sometimes scientific determination of male and female, referring to chromosome patterns, anatomy, genitalia, etc., hormones. But often, or not often, I should say, but occasionally, even that is not entirely clear. That children can be born and require surgeries to, and usually take surgeries to delineate or define their sex if there is some confusion. That actually happens sometimes, and sometimes more often than we realize. But that's a thing. But generally, that's referring to biology. Gender is more of a concept or a construct, ideas that we have placed upon those genders, like that we've already been talking about in some of the discussion boards, that women clean and that men lift heavy things, girls like pink, boys don't cry, those kinds of ideas. These are completely based on social constructs, which is the next item that as you go through the glossary, the items that are more highlighted are the ones that I'm particularly interested in using in the class, although please do read all of them. But these are ideas, social construct, these ideas that gender is socially and culturally produced rather than it's some sort of based in some static biology. Women just love pink, they just do, this kind of silly. Or that boys don't like pink, those kinds of ideas. Gender identity and gender expression. These are some ideas why I decided to go ahead and include the genderbread person graphic. It's on now on the main page, on the content page as an image, just to help kind of give you understanding about those continuums. I'm going to move on ahead to the idea of cisgender. A cisgender person is a person who feels like they are born into the bodies that are sexually, the sort of sex and gender they feel lines up for themselves. So I'm a cisgendered male person. A transgender person is a person who may not have those same feelings. And transgenderism is typically is a very small minority of people who have this sort of experience. I've had, I think I've only had 2 transgender students since I started teaching at Wesleyan in about 10 years that I know of, 2 that have come out to me in that way. So it's a fairly small population of people. But there often is a little bit of confusion about what a transgender person is, whether they're a person who, the difference between a transgender person and maybe a person who's a transsexual or a drag king or a drag queen, a cross-dresser, and that their sexuality and sexual identity and gender identity are all not the same thing. These are all different things. And I think that can be sometimes complicated for people who don't understand. But again, I would encourage you to look at the genderbread person infographic, which I'm going to pull up right now while we're talking, or while I'm talking, just to look at it, those sort of continuums, rather than looking at them as a binary, which is a really strict one or the other. Many of them, and many are experienced sort of as continuums. The gender identity between woman and man, between gender expression, being feminine or masculine, your biological sex, and your sexual orientation, right? These are all sort of different things, and they occur in different places and are expressed in different ways. So look at the genderbread person and have a little look at that and see if that may help you kind of get to some of these ideas. The definitions of patriarchy and feminism, they're there. I think the idea of privilege is an important one. It's one that gets tossed around a lot. People say, check your privilege. But it's difficult sometimes because privilege isn't something that we take. It's something that's simply conferred, a status conferred by whatever society does. So, for example, in our conversations around film, it's simply presumed that men have privilege in films, both as producers and creators of films, which is still true in Hollywood. In fact, I was involved in a film last summer that received a grant specifically because it's one of the few films around that had an all-female creative team. There's a female director of photography, a female director, a female screenwriter, a main female producer, and the lead was a female. And that is incredibly rare that you would have all women. It is totally common to have all men in all of those roles in many films. And so it's interesting to me that although women make up half the population, it's still quite common for things to be dominated by men. And getting to some of your conversations that you've had already in the discussion threads, that can be partially because Hollywood is still dominated by men predominantly as producers, but also it's about marketing. It's about what those men think, who those men think are coming to the theater. And in some cases, like I went to see Civil War last week before I came to Alaska, it was all men in the theater. I think there were maybe 5 or 6 women in a theater of a very full theater in Buchanan. It gets into some interesting questions, though, about are they producing things because that's the audience, or are the audience there because of what they're producing? There's some really fascinating conversations around the recent Star Wars movie that had a female protagonist, and yet there was so little marketing done and merchandising done for women, or featuring that main strong female lead of that movie. So it's very curious. It's very interesting. But anyway, privilege is often linked to power, which refers to the ability of individuals or groups to induce or influence the beliefs or actions of other persons or groups. Access to resources that enhance one's chances of getting what one needs in life. And so sometimes that is it's often heavily dependent on one's social status. So if you are white, if you're able-bodied, if you are within a certain demographic of age, these are certain power and privileges that are just conferred upon you because of the prevailing classes. It's interesting now that I've turned 41, I've aged out of what is the predominant marketing group, which is 25 to 35 or 20 to 35. Is the main group that America still markets towards. So when I watch television now and I see commercials, I realize, I'm no longer the target market. And I wasn't aware of being the target market when I was in it, because that was the world that I was a part of. It was the world that I was in. So I saw it reflected everywhere. And I think social media helps this or reinforces this idea, because if we disagree with someone, or we have a difference of opinion, or they are in some way we think other than ourselves in a way that we don't want to put up with, we can simply block them, unfollow them, unfriend them, and whatever. And so we end up in these little echo chambers of people that only basically reinforce and agree with all of our own ideas, which is comforting in some ways, but I think also very dangerous because we don't really get access to other people's ideas and thoughts until we go around thinking that everybody believes the same things that we do. Objectification is the sexualization of women, whereby they are transformed from being subjects into being objects of men's desires. Meaning, so for example, women literally become things. This happens a lot in marketing. Women's bodies become objects, like they become beer bottles, they become footballs, they become whatever. And you can see that happen a lot. It's also interesting because it doesn't just happen to women. And women's bodies, like many things, can be sexualized, and many other beings, other people can be sexualized. Men's bodies, particularly black men's bodies or black women's bodies. Other bodies can be exoticized, Asian bodies, right? Asian women as exotic creatures. These are sort of tropes and concepts that are very much based, again, in the sort of white male view. Able-bodied, young, et cetera, whatever that person is. We talk a little bit about sexual double standards in the binary gender system. So the idea that the system's all in a binary, that you must either be male or female. I've been asked before when dating someone, I think it's already come out that I myself am a gay man, that people have asked me, they're like, yeah, well, who's the man and who's the woman in your relationship? That, that we must somebody has to fill both of those roles, is kind of interesting. So it's not just... that doesn't happen just to straight people, but that there is this idea that men have certain roles and women have certain roles, and everybody has to behave in those sort of ways when there's a pairing. and that there's always just a pairing of two. Is kind of interesting too. There's a sexual double standard, which is the previous one. I'm going back one. Allowing men who have lots of sex to be considered to be celebrated in certain ways, and that women who have had lots of sex are not. They're to be denigrated. This also extends beyond heteronormative things. For example, gay men who like lots of sex, for example, might be called a bossy bottom, or who are whatever. So there's all these kind of really interesting ways that polarization plays itself out in our I don't know, in all kinds of ways. It becomes very interesting. I think I've gone over all of the things. You guys are having really great conversations in the class so far in discussions, and I hope that we're able to apply these concepts to some of the artworks that we're going to be looking at. And just mostly what it is just to be aware of when these kinds of things show up and how do we participate in them consciously or unconsciously. I have a lot of young women in my life. I have daughters. I have nieces. And so sometimes when I'm buying things for them, I become really aware that I want to get my daughter a doctor toy thing. She's 6, 7, and she wants the doctor kit to play with, and I can only find ones that are pink and purple because they're for girls, right? And so I'm like, well, it's a stethoscope, so why does it have to be purple? Why does it have to be a princess stethoscope? So these are kind of interesting things where the places where this plays out and the expectations that we place on gender happen pretty early. And this gets back to Michael Kimball's concept, which is, are these ideas useful for us, or are they really just confusing or limiting in many ways? And so that's it. So continue having great conversations. I hope this was helpful. I'm going to be leaving things open through Sunday, but please make sure you get in and comment and on your classmates. Go back and watch all your classmates' introductory videos. We had a couple students join the class kind of later or midweek this week. So go back and look at all the videos and make sure that we get to know each other's faces a little bit, because I'm going to start asking that some of our posts go from being just written posts to being videos of ourselves commenting, which I think would be kind of interesting.